Talking flowers and talking caterpillars, a tea party under a tree, white roses painted red. Well, the garden in Alice in Wonderland is a place that's alive with mystery, surprises, delight and absurdity. It's a true children's playground. The garden in literature can also tell us about hidden desires, the wild undergrowth and entanglement of relationships, and the stifling sameness of suburban blocks. And of course, there's nothing nicer than sitting under a shady tree in a garden filled with the song of spring, eating an apple and reading. So when gardeners aren't busy pruning or tending to the compost heap, what do they read under a shady tree? I'm joined today by three gardeners to find out what fertilises their minds and creativity. Stephen Ryan, Terry Smyth and Michael McCoy. Stephen Ryan is the presenter of ABC TV's Gardening Australia. He ran his family's nursery until he started his own in 1980. He proudly tends his garden to Gurium in Macedon, Victoria. And did you know that he's a collector of antique gardening books? Terry Smyth has worked as a horticulturalist and curator of the Southern Chinese plant collection at Melbourne's Royal Botanic Gardens for 22 years. And in the 90s, she collected seeds, plants and herbarium specimens for the gardens on 4 collecting trips to South China. And Michael McCoy is a garden designer and author. He's designed gardens for the likes of Paul Keating and Leo Schofield. His first book, Michael McCoy's Garden, was published in 2000. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Well, Stephen, I'll start with you. Robert Louis Stevenson said, "It is a golden maxim to cultivate the garden, for the nose and the eyes will take care of themselves." So what do you think? Are rules like this helpful in gardening?
They're helpful if you know them, but then you need to know them to ignore them. I think rules are only there to be ignored because a garden should be a reflection of the person who owns it. So the rules might be useful for how high a step should be so that you're comfortably walking around the garden, or how deep a fish pond should be if you're going to grow a water lily. There's certain rules you need, but beyond that, it should be you.
Well, what about commandments like the 10 Commandments? I mean, is there a gardening Bible? Do you have a Bible that you swear by?
Look, there's lots of good gardening Bibles if you're looking for the basics. If somebody's coming into gardening for the first time, I mean, things like the Yates Garden Guide and all those things are fantastic just to get you started. But of course, when you become a passionate gardener, really it's about being out there and trialling things that's important. So in fact, you don't use a lot of your reference books to work out how you're going to put things together because you want to try them yourself. But you might look up something to find out whether it likes some shade or it likes some a moist soil or whatever. But really, when you're actually tending a garden, that's not the time to be reading.
What about you, Terry? DJ Mabberley's The Plant Book, a portable dictionary of the vascular plants, is the only book you took on your seed collecting trips to China. I think it's your Bible. I've had a look at it on Google Books today. It's a pretty technical book.
Yes, it's a technical book, but it's a book that is light and small, and it's rice paper, and it has 20,000 species in it, every single genera and family of seed-bearing plants, of flowering plants, of conifers, of even the ferns, and so it's just a great place to start. It's a brilliant fact book.
So is it like, what plant is that?
It's kind of like that. Look, it will have the barest information about a genus. It'll have a common name. It'll have the family. It may have a whole lot of information if it's a plant that's really useful for humans. For if it's a really interesting timber plant, or if it's tea or something like that. But it's just a great place to start to get the nomenclature right, to get the spelling right. And it's funny that I really love this book, because reading Alice in Wonderland when I was away on holiday this year, there was a part of Alice in Wonderland that really took my fancy. There's I think it's Alice Through the Looking Glass. There's a wood where things have no names, and every time anyone or anything goes into that wood, the names are completely forgotten. And I quite like that idea, even though I totally am in love with this Mabberley book that's where everything is so correct and precise.
What about you, Michael? You're a gardening designer and a writer. Who do you turn to for inspiration?
Well, without a doubt, my primary inspiration is a writer named Christopher Lloyd, writer and gardener named Christopher Lloyd. And it's interesting that we've talked about rules and we've talked about a Bible. And I think that what Christopher Lloyd does for a lot of gardeners, and certainly for me, is to free you from this implied legalism that runs through gardening. And I think there is a lot of that. When you first come to it, it feels like something that is frighteningly legalistic, sometimes even moralistic.
Like what?
Well, there's just... there was perhaps through most of last century a lot of good growers kept what they knew secret from others about how they would grow things to perfection. And so there's this sort of underlying feeling, and I think it probably emerged with the whole parallel with Victorian moralism as well, is that just these implied rules about the way things must be done, the way they should be done, and beginners to gardening are always really concerned about that, about doing things the right way. And what Christopher Lloyd really makes so clear is there really is no right way, or if there is, it is only a guideline. So when we talk to Stephen about rules, it's really guidelines that are useful, but only to a point. And for me, what I needed to be was freed from worrying about the right way of doing something and liberated just to experiment.
So The Well-Tempered Garden is the book that you nominate.
The Well-Tempered Garden is the one that is seen to be his major work, but The Adventurous Gardener, which I have here, was the one for me that really kept me within gardening. I was really on the point as an apprentice of giving the whole thing up in disillusionment, and someone gave me this book to read in an attempt to sort of try and save me from this disillusionment, and I kept it for a polite length of time, as you do, with no intention of reading it. And the night before I gave it back, I thought, look, I'd better flip it open and at least be able to make some comment that might deflect from the fact that distract from the fact that I hadn't read it. Started reading the preface and was absolutely immediately a disciple. It has completely framed my gardening since.
What was the moment that you were going to turn your back on it? Why were you so disillusioned? I had finished a science degree in botany and really felt like I just wanted to, my real interest was connectedness, I guess, with nature, and I went into gardening thinking this was going to do it for me, and just found that within professional gardening there was none of the passion that I found amongst amateur gardeners, and quickly became disillusioned about professional gardening as a suitable place to spend the rest of my life. And what did Christopher Lloyd awaken you? What was it that he allowed you to discover about gardening?
A way of thinking. Because I'd come from a science background, I guess it was a level of inquiry which I had not found within gardening. I found it to be legalistic, as I was saying before. And I noticed when I opened this book today that I've marked in a little sentence. May I read this one? It's all very well to accept received advice and opinions gratefully and at face value when you're starting, but we graduate. A leavening of scepticism and independence of thought is healthy. You'll make mistakes, but you'll perhaps learn not to mind making them. That's a great release from all sorts of inhibitions. It's that sort of thinking which he carries right through his gardening and right through his writing, and that freed me up entirely from this obsession with the right way of doing things, and made me think maybe there was someone in the world thinking, if there was someone in gardening thinking like this, maybe there was a place for me. And I got to live and work with him at a later date, but that's probably for a later question, I guess.
What about you, Terry? I understand it was your mother's collection of books on New Zealand plants and her encouragement that led you to study horticulture.
Yes, my mother has 6 children, and she was always keen on gardening and all sorts of things, and seemed to encourage us in our separate ways of what we were interested in. I've got this book here, The Fairy Doll, that she gave me when I was 4, that has some lovely. It's a lovely story about a little girl who's very average, and I always felt like I was very average. And this little girl doesn't seem to be able to do things very well, but she got courage from a little Christmas decoration, the fairy doll, and this little girl made a small garden for this toy, and a walnut bed with moss inside it. And as a four-year-old, and I think I loved that book till I was probably 10 or something, I just was so enchanted with that idea of making a little space for this private little friend. And this little girl is really encouraged by this idea. And after that, my father read us that beautiful book, The Secret Garden, and he would read us chapter by chapter every day. And he always would put on the voices. He was an actor, and he would read us a chapter at a time. My mother bought that book. She was going into hospital and said to my dad, "Read them a story." And so she was a great influence, and many of my garden books that are I did an apprenticeship in New Zealand in the Wellington Botanic Gardens, and many of the books that I have on New Zealand plants, they love from Patricia, from my mother. So it was a great encouragement.
And I can see, hearing you, the idea of those books still moves you.
Yes, it does.
What about you, Stephen? You were given a book when you were 12 called The Boy with the Green Thumb.
Yes.
By Barbara Eufen Todd.
Yeah, I've got to find a copy of it. I don't know what happened to my copy. I haven't got it here to be able to show anybody. But I sort of fell into gardening at the ripe old age of 10. Before that time, I was into nature and animals and anything natural anyway. But my father actually opened a nursery when I was 10 years old. And it was, immediately I knew what I wanted to do at 10 years old. I'm going to be a nurseryman, and this is going to be my nursery, which it didn't end up being, but nonetheless I was going to be the nurseryman. And so, of course, my primary school teachers and things, I used to go along waxing lyrical with Latin names and God knows what else at 10 years old, because at 10 I knew more than my peers, so I thought I was really intelligent when it came to gardening at least. And so the principal of the school at the time, I got an award for something or another, gave me this book about the boy with the green thumb. And it was about this little boy who actually had a truly green thumb, and he could touch things and make them grow in outlandish ways and really fast and giant and all sorts of stuff. And it was the sort of thing that engaged with me, and I thought, well, yeah, I can do that. So it was
pure ego.
Yeah, pure ego.
Well, there's something, I don't know, it seems very wholesome about gardening, about being out there in the sunshine and tending to plants. It's also about the good life. Even Sylvia Plath, who was a pretty depressed girl, wrote to her mother to tell her how happy gardening made her feel. Plath wrote in this 1962 letter, "These last few days I've been weeding our strawberry patch and setting the runners, and at night I shut my eyes and see the beautiful little plants with the starry flowers and beginning berries. I love this outdoor work and feel I am really getting into condition." Sadly, it didn't last for her. But Terry, you brought along a book by Lynn Strong.
Lynn Strong.
Lynn Strong, about the meaning of gardening. Tell us about it.
It's a beautiful little book called Gardens of Light by Lynn Strong, The Making, History and Meaning of Gardens. And it's lots and lots of little short stories. Some are only 3 pages, some are 5 pages. And she writes about, quite often about Victoria, about places that she knows, about colour, she writes about colour in a way that I find very moving, and she writes about movement in the garden. She writes about Rome. She writes about lilies in a vase, maybe being more like octopuses than they are really floral. And she writes in a way that makes you think that when you leave the room, the lily might climb out of the vase and kind of cross the air. And she writes just in a way that I find makes me want to go and read history or read further around the subject. So I found this book really helpful, really useful. I've read it in the garden a lot, and it's full of I think that the children I was sharing the garden with at the time were watering the garden, and it got left out, so it's rather raggedy. But
it sounds like you're struck by her association with gardens in the imagination, or plants in the imagination, the
and
human
she writes
imagination.
in funny stories about. There's one about a garden in Echuca where there's been a butchered, tortured tree that's been lopped, and somebody's strung up boots with their bootstraps and planted polyanthus in each of the boots, and just crazy funny stories like that, as well as lots of bits of history and ideas about colour and even what to wear in the garden. It's very whimsical, and she's a poet too.
Well, Michael, you have been influenced by the philosophy of David Grayson to sort of evolve your approach to gardening. Tell me who David Grayson is to begin with.
Well, David Grayson, I discovered him when, just in desperation, looking for something to read and going through some boxes in my mother's garage, and it literally fell into my hands, this little book, Adventures in Understanding, and it immediately struck a chord with me, the way he went about his life. He was living a sort of, I guess, an early tree change, about 1920s or so, farmer, philosopher, gardener. So this is all pre-internet days, so it was tricky to try and find all the rest of his books, but eventually old Jack Bradstreet, I don't know if any of you remember him.
Camberwell, wasn't it?
In Hawthorne.
Oh, Hawthorne, that's right.
He was able to find most of them for me. And it made, through him, I made some strong connections with some other major, through David Grayson, and trying to find out about him, I made connections with some other garden writers and gardeners of the past.
He was a journalist, wasn't he? I think he had
another
name.
Well, it turns out his real name was Ray Stannard Baker, and not only was David Grayson just a pseudonym, he was a completely fictitious character. There was no farmer, philosopher, gardener at all. And this is after I'd pretty much used him as the formula on which I based my entire life. I've only just recently found this out, thanks to the internet.
Yes, there's a Wikipedia entry.
I know. I still can't quite believe it. And as far as I'm concerned, David Grayson is more real than Ray Stannard Baker. But it was more about his need to connect with nature, rather, and it was about the fact that he wrote about what he was doing in day to day, with the idea that this gave him sort of double the pleasure, once in experiencing the thing, then again in writing about it, and then possibly in the future reading it. And he says he wrote, this fictitious character, that he wrote with no intention of publication. And this is what got me writing, got me realising that there was a way of recording the pleasures of the simple sort of pleasures of a day in the garden in a way as to amplify those pleasures.
And amplify them for yourself and for others.
As it turns out, for others, yes, as well.
I don't think you should be disillusioned at all by this story.
Well, no.
If an idea is a good idea, it's going to stand up.
Absolutely, and as Virginia Woolf says in her book Orlando about the power, she speaks about the power of illusion. Don't ever, disenchant or remove a good, healthy illusion from someone. And I think this has been a good, life-giving illusion, so I'll hang on to it.
And wasn't Orlando about someone who lived 400 years or something like that?
It was about Vita SackvilleWest, actually.
And changed sex along the way.
That's right, yes.
So, it doesn't have to be a documentary.
That's right.
Well, Stephen, we've talked about the wholesomeness of gardening, the philosophy of gardening. Politics still rears its head, of course. Michael Pollan, who's has written about the politics of food production and consumption, he's also written about gardening. And in his book, Second Nature, he explores, amongst other things, the politics of mowing. Is it morally wrong to let your grass grow and not mow your lawn?
Absolutely not. In fact, that's part of the issue I think we have in this modern day with gardening, is that there are lots of people out there telling us what is politically or morally correct or otherwise, and what we should or shouldn't be doing. There are people telling us what plants we should be growing, how often or when we should water our garden, what types of plants we should have in our gardens. So there's all these people trying to tell us how we should be gardening, when in fact I believe we should be doing it as something that strengthens us as a person, so therefore you need to do it for yourself.
But there are water shortages that therefore dictated about
get me on the water shortages.
How often we're going to do our garden and what we ought to be growing.
You will regret that comment.
Give it to me. Sock it to me.
As far as I'm concerned, if I want to grow a carrot and water it, I should be allowed to. If I can't water my carrot, that means I have to buy somebody else's carrot and somebody else watered that one. So I think we've been handed a bit of a furphy about this watering of gardens. What people don't realise is that good gardeners don't waste water, they water well, and they create green spaces which attracts rain. So in fact, by restricting us in watering, we're probably producing the deserts they were scared they were going to have. So there.
So, Mike, tell me about Michael Pollan.
Well, look, I mean, he's an amazing writer, and I love the fact that he can look at something fairly basic like mowing the grass and create this enormous sort of moral thing around it, because not many people do think these things through. I mean, the grass needs cutting, you go out and you cut it. But somebody like Michael will then look into the whole thing and look at what, is it appropriate to do, and look at how much expenditure of effort you're putting into something that maybe you could be turning into something else. And so, I mean, everybody who wants to garden should read his sort of writing just to get a sense of all the nonsense that's actually out there.
He's a sort of gardening revolutionary.
He was, yeah. And I think that's a very appropriate thing to have, because gardeners in general aren't seen as revolutionary people. They're seen as sort of grounded people who are out there getting their hands dirty and perhaps not thinking beyond what they're doing at the moment, because gardening can be a very sort of relaxing, at the moment type of exercise. But there are lots of conundrums that we should be thinking about whilst we're gardening, and whether we should be growing this or doing that or whatever. And then once we've made the decision, then we should get on and do it.
Now, I wanted to talk about great gardening writers. And Stephen, Gertrude Jekyll, or Jekyll, depending on, well, I think it's Jekyll, isn't it? That's what Wikipedia says, is one of the towering figures of gardening writing. She said gardening was like painting a landscape. So how would you describe her influence on gardeners?
Her influence was absolutely enormous, there's no doubt. I mean, she was in parallel with, she was trained as an artist before her eyesight failed, and she was, I guess, contemporaries with the Impressionists, coming to a whole new understanding that colour actually comes from light, is a breaking down of light, and in a similar way started to think of plant colours in the way that Impressionists were thinking about their paint colours, and this was enormously influential. And I think, I mean, one of the odd things is definitely the gardeners who were writing at that time. There were some other major figures like William Robinson, other ones that we remember as these luminaries of gardening, but really it was their writing that preserved their philosophy. So there was probably a lot of other interesting stuff going on at the time. But she is still to this day, I mean, it's incredible, really, quoted as the be-all and end-all in colour theory with plant use. Personally, I haven't found her all that empowering, but at the same time, there's no doubt about the influence. It's enormous.
Michael, thank you for that. And Stephen, what do you think?
Well, she was influential in her time, and I mean, there's still Jekyll borders out there that people are slavishly holding the same plants and the same colour coordinations and so forth that she had. But not many of us have the 14 gardeners or whatever she had either. So, she virtually impoverished herself with her gardening because it cost her so much to create the garden that she was doing. And she did write in lots of ways, as many of those people in that era did, wrote for the landed gentry virtually. So you do have to look at what she wrote and then think, now, can I attain something like that? Because she had all these minions that would sort of rush in and do what she wanted. And some of her writing is basically like reading a fairy tale now, because you just couldn't do it.
And what was her theory about colour?
Well, she ran through the colour palette, so her colours went through in a sort of a sweep. You'd start from the pale colours or the warm colours and work your way through to the cool colours. So there was no jarriness about her plantings, which is actually something that I enjoy. Is in fact things that bounce at you instead of being far too colour coordinated. In fact, I think we ended up in an era where colour coordinating became the be-all and end-all, and if you look at some of her plans, her plantings were very cleverly colour coordinated, but there was almost no texture or interest in the plant material because it was amorphous stuff that had the right colour, and that's what she did. So you needed to move on then, and people like Christopher Lloyd that Michael's mentioned before, he virtually ripped up the colour guidebook and did what he wanted, and he actually used textures and forms and shapes to great effect and did that far better and far, I think, more excitingly than just sticking to the sort of format that Jekyll put in place.
Well, Michael, of course, Emily Dickinson, Vita Sackville-West, Leonard Woolf, they're all writers who've tended gardens. Let's talk about Vita Sackville-West, and she's known, of course, for her garden at Sissinghurst Castle. She wrote many novels and also a gardening column for The Observer, which has been collected in book form. What did she bring to the garden?
I think a not dissimilar sort of level of inquiry and experimentation than Christopher Lloyd had. And it was something I've been thinking about just today in preparing for this, about the idea of gardeners who wrote as compared to the modern day idea of a journalist who adopts the gardening as their subject of choice. That do you think there's a distinction, that when you think that Vita was first and foremost a gardener, she loved her she actually hated writing the column. She used to really resent the fact that she had to write this column in order to raise money to keep the garden going. But she just had this lovely humility about just trying stuff, giving it a go. She wasn't writing from a place of being an expert, and I've come to really be myself to a certain suspicion of expertise within gardening. It's just such a huge subject, and I'm only really interested myself in reading the writings of, and myself in writing in the style of a fellow journeyman, someone who's along for the ride and learning along with the readers. And she was terrific at that. But of course she'd come from Knoll, which was the biggest non-royal house in England. The house itself covers 4 acres of land, and lost that, which she didn't inherit as she expected to, and then Sissinghurst became her great love, and lived an absolutely crazy life, which has since been well publicised. So she's getting a lot of attention from those other parts of her life. But no, I think it was probably a style that comes out of both Christopher Lloyd and someone like Marjorie Fish as well, of gardeners who wrote.
Well, talking about gardening in Australia, I think we have to talk about Edna Walling, one of Australia's most well-known gardeners, and she's also written about her toiling in the soil. She writes that her favourite sort of garden is a place where the foxgloves marched gaily over to the lupin beds and the forget-me-nots romped merrily over the primrose borders. I'm not quite sure what she was on. But
something.
What's her influence on Australian gardeners?
I actually think her influence isn't quite as large as some people think, or some people would like to have. I think in Australia we have this issue where we've got a very short history, so anybody can almost be a big fish in a small pond. And I mean, she was a great landscaper, don't get me wrong, and she was certainly before her time. I mean, she might have written that about all of those English wildflowers, but she then moved on to using a lot of Australian native plant material, so she evolved and changed, which was interesting. She did her Bickley Vale estate. She was one of the early people who tried to coordinate a housing estate and create something that was holistic and worked well as a whole, instead of something that was just houses of all sorts of different styles plonked onto a landscape with disparate sort of gardens plonked around them. So she did lots of interesting things, but her actual landscapes were more about just layout and design, I think, in the end, because a lot of the planting material she used was fairly amorphous stuff. And so she created these very calm, cool, collected places that generally had nice rockwork, nice sort of garden rooms, if you're going to use the term, and they were just lovely gardens. But I have to say, if she'd been in England, she probably would never have sort of been where she is in people's visions now, because she would have been one of the many. Whereas here she was sort of on her own. So she was unique in that way, I think.
But she started to celebrate the Australian flora, didn't she? And she said the Australian flora was like pearls before swine, which was a pretty...
Not really celebrating the Australian human beings, though. The swine.
I wonder if she was similar to Jekyll, though, in a voice in Australia, similar in breaking away from the rigidity of the gardening that had gone before. I mean, what you quoted is definitely this thing of embracing the romance and the freedom, which is something which the Victorian era had really squeezed right out. And Jekyll and William Robinson, etc., in England were the voices of bringing back just hardy stuff that did well without a whole lot of care and without a whole lot of staff. And I think Jekyll probably maybe 20 years later was a similar voice here in Australia.
Well, you mentioned Australian plants, and if we think about garden plants, or common garden plants, azaleas, wisteria, gardenias, camellias, they're all common camellias, but they come from Indonesia and China and Japan. The world of gardening has changed as more varieties are discovered and introduced to our private plots. And it's really plant adventurers who have brought new plants to our attention. Terry Smyth, given your own seed collecting journeys to China, I guess it's not surprising you're drawn to plant explorers like Roy Lancaster, who wrote Travels in China, A Plantsman's Paradise. Tell us about him and what influence he's had.
His book, Roy Lancaster. This book was given to me just after the first plant collecting trip I'd done, and I had been borrowing this from our fantastic library at the Botanic Gardens. We have apparently the most comprehensive botanical library in Australia, so it's a fantastic resource. And but I'd been borrowing this book as much as I could, and then my friend, who's sitting in the audience here, actually found this book and gave it to me and said, "Oh, I thought you might be interested in this," and I was so excited. So Roy Lancaster is a great plantsman who's the kind of writer that excites me about plants, because he talks about, in this book, he talks about his journey into China, into areas where I've been too, and the way he writes, he talks about plant association, what different plants are growing with each other, and the soil, all the detail that if you're interested in plants, you really need to know where they come from if you want to grow them back in Australia. And he also introduces lots of bits of history, and there's a whole earlier part in the book that talks about different plant explorers, which is great for me. People like Robert Fortune, who was a Scotsman who went to China many times, actually working for a large company, and he was asked to go and actually find tea. He'd been to China many times before, and so they thought that he would be the perfect person to go and bring tea back. It was basically espionage, really. And
out of the great game.
He wore a long pigtail. Apparently he nearly got sprung when he couldn't use chopsticks, but he managed to bring tea back and to. But most of those plants died, so the next time he went, he actually managed to persuade some local people to work for him, and they would have died if they had been caught. But Robert Fortune brought back all sorts of species, including lots of peonies, and basically stole tea from the Chinese, and then wrote a book about it, which apparently was a very big seller. It's also in our library. I've been allowed to borrow that book and just look at it with gloves on, because it's a very old book, late 1800s. So it's fascinating to go into that library and look. There's a book that I just looked at last week that is from the era 1531. It's a herbal written in Latin, and there's actually candle wax on the paper, and the paper is all linen, made of linen. So it's got no chemicals in it, no acid. So it's and because it's kept so perfectly cool and dry, it's nearly 500 years old.
Well, Stephen, you've brought in a book by Daniel Hinckley called The Explorer's Garden. What's the significance of that book to you?
Dan Hinckley is also probably, in a way, like Roy Lancaster. He's a plantsman.
What is a plantsman? What's the difference between a plantsman and a gardener?
Well, a plantsman's somebody who really loves plants, and the plant comes first. You know, the garden can come together after, and some plantsmen make great gardeners, others just make collections. And I have to say, Dan Hinckley makes great gardens as well as collecting plants. But when he went out into the wild, he's looking at it with the eye of a plantsman. A lot of collectors that went out were collecting everything and anything, just because it was there. Dan was looking for things that he knew would make good plants, particularly for his own climate back in the Pacific Northwest in the US. And he's been into lots of different parts of Asia and different parts of the world, and he's so far come out with 2 books. This one's his Shrub and Vines book, and there's also a perennials one, and he talks about them in such an enthusiastic way, these plants that he's finding in the wild, and how they respond when he got them back into his own garden, and whether they turned out to be good garden plants or not, or whether he imported something and it turned out to be a different plant altogether once he flowered in his own garden. So it's warts and all about his collecting and what have you, and seriously well written. So it's a jolly sort of travelogue that you can sort of get involved in, and even if you're not much of a plant person yourself, you get dragged along with his stories and, you know, the places he's been to and his diary entries and all that sort of thing. And so for me, his books are just great fun to read and to find out about plants I haven't met yet, which I think is fantastic.
Even his catalogues are good fun.
Oh, yeah. Yes, unfortunately he doesn't run his nursery anymore, but he used to produce a nursery catalogue that was sort of 1.5 inches thick, and it was just full of wonderful, witty sort of anecdotes and things about the plants that he was growing, most of which were attuned to try and part people from their money to buy the plants, but nonetheless a really, really good catalogue.
Terry, you've also got a collection of books on Chinese plants, but as a result of your travels to China, you have the sinologist Joseph Needham's writing, and he was the subject of Simon Winchester's book on him a few years ago. This guy who introduced the history of Chinese technology and science to the Chinese themselves.
Well, I don't actually own that book. A friend lent it to me. I learnt about Needham through this book, through Peter Valder's book. But yes, I was so fascinated to read that I think it's the volume 6 of his series, and just to learn that all sorts of crazy bits of information, like the Chinese invented the wheelbarrow, and they invented sowing seed in rows rather than like the rest of us were just scattering the seed everywhere amongst the and so it wasn't easy to manage crops. So just all of those sorts of bits of information I found fascinating in that Joseph Needham book.
Michael, in your book collection, you have Sylvia Crow's garden design. This did what for you?
Well, when Stephen before was talking about plantsmen, and some plantsmen can make good gardens, but mostly they're often just collections. For me, it made me stop thinking about plants primarily as being the fundamental tool, I guess, in gardens. And I'm now absolutely convinced that our gut reaction in stepping into a garden is not about what we're seeing. It's not about the plant content or the decorative element. It's about how we are captured and held within really good spaces. That first and foremost. But because we have no vocab for that, we're not used to thinking about that, we usually look straight to the plants to try and find our source of pleasure. And I think that Sylvia Crow's book on garden design. I mean, there's millions of books now on garden design, but it was an early one from, I think, about the 1950s, first published, was for me absolutely pivotal. Was the first garden design book I read, and absolutely would be the one that I would return to time and time again, because she made me think on that larger scale.
So it's about the architecture of the garden.
And she mentions plants as well, but it only as an element within a garden, and that it since has become so overwhelmingly important to me, that whole idea of spatial manipulation within a garden. Just as an architect would be thinking about how it feels to be in a room, exactly the same thing in a garden. How is it feeling to be here? And as I say, we don't really have a vocab for this in the garden, and so we always our eyes are looking to understand what our gut is feeling, but I'm sure the gut reaction is spatial.
Now, Stephen, you're a collector of antique books on gardening. That must be an expensive hobby.
Oh, it is, and there are a couple of book dealers out there that know exactly what my tastes are like, and I'll get a phone call and it'll be, I have got a copy of so-and-so's something or another that you can't live without, and it's only going to cost you $600. And most of the time it's exactly what I needed for my collection anyway. They know me far too well. And I collect them because I find them fascinating. I mean, you go back far enough and you can find out when plants came into Western cultivation. You find out lots of useful information about the plants. You also find out all sorts of weird and wonderful and wacky trivia about plants, things that they thought plants would do that we now know they don't.
Like what?
The sort of medicinal values of some plants. I mean, when you go back to the signature of flowers, where they thought because the spotty leaf of a pulmonaria looked like a diseased lung, it was going to cure lung disease. I mean, probably does, but it's that sort of thing that is fascinating. And so antique garden books I find intriguing. I like to read about how people thought 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, what they were gardening, what were their priorities in gardening, and it's always fun to try and translate the Old English and get your S's and F's turned around and all that sort of thing. So it's quite an entertaining thing, and I just love to hold an old book.
We talked a little bit about Alice in Wonderland at the beginning, but can I ask you, we've talked about non-fiction a lot and all kinds of compendiums of gardening and columns, and what about fiction? What do you read? Do you read fiction for fun?
I do.
What are you reading at the moment?
Dare I say I'm still finishing my dictionary. But I actually enjoy, if I'm going to take myself away from horticulture at all, I like to take myself well away, and I read quite a lot of fantasy. I mean, I've read Lord of the Rings about 4 times. I love to be in worlds that don't exist, and for me, fantasy is a complete and utter sort of escape from the world. And so I don't know how many books on fantasy I've read. Lord of the Rings is probably the only one I've read more than once. And I do have to say there are some authors out there that need to know how to shorten a story so that it doesn't last for 10 volumes. It seems to be the thing in fantasy these days, that the story will keep going for volume after volume, and I do get tired after a while. But I just love the idea of all this fanciful stuff. That's for me a thing that will take me right away.
What about you, Terry?
Oh, this year I've read Tim Winton and, as I said, Alice in Wonderland, and I'm afraid I've just bought a book on Corriers, so that's non-fiction again. The Maria Hitchcock book. Major Prendergast's Last Stand, or can't quite remember the author's name, but lately I've been reading mainly non-fiction. What
about you, Michael?
Well, I usually have something non-fiction, something gardening-ish and non-fiction on the go at all times, but there'll be novels dispersed throughout that. And I brought along Brideshead Revisited just as a book that I constantly revisit and reread.
Why?
And because I don't know what it's about. I'm still trying to work it out.
It's got a garden in it.
It's got a garden in it, which I quite like. But actually, I have almost no memory of reading something particularly for its garden associations within fiction. Though there is this amazing description in Orlando, as I was saying before, about when Virginia Woolf sort of describes each of the phases of English history, since the Middle Ages at least, as being defined by a certain climate as well. And when the Victorian era comes in, basically all this moss and damp starts to grow up all the walls of these houses, and the houses are all engulfed in ivy, and it's the most incredible image of this sort of this onset of and it's supposed to be obviously metaphorical regarding all sorts of stuff that was going on in that era. So there are associations like that, but I can't think ever of reading fiction for the sake of the horticultural content. No.